this lecture, number 4, we again move forward in time. The span of prehistory covered in this course is enormous, and the segment we have today is large. It goes from about 2 million years ago up to about 500,000 years ago or somewhat later. We can't give you a precise date for the end of this particular time bracket. Again, a high percentage of prehistory, but as you'll find as we go through the course, the chronological span gets smaller and smaller until it comes down sometimes to mere thousands of years or centuries even. In this lecture, we're going to describe the first appearance of Homo erectus, the descendant of Homo in Africa, and then we're going to talk about the spread of these archaic humans out of tropical Africa and the first settlement of Asia. We're going to talk about Europe in Lecture 5. We begin by introducing a very fundamental background here, that of the Ice Age, and make the point that climatic changes have been constant since 780,000 years ago, and that these changes played a major role in human biological and cultural evolution. After that, I'm going to describe the first Homo erectus fossils from Africa, which incidentally are sometimes called Homo ergaster, to add to the confusion of fossil names on the table, before describing the spread of erectus across the Sahara out of its original homeland as part of a series of waves of mammalian migration, which culminated about 700,000 years ago. And then finally, I'll summarize what little is known about the first human inhabitants of Asia and their lifeway. Their culture changed little until the appearance of fully modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, in the region, perhaps as early as 75,000 years ago. The date is unknown. I want to make a point now that throughout this course, our perspective is not just going to be confined to Europe or North America or some other small area. It's always going to be ardently international, because prehistory is a global subject, not a provincial one. And this course, The Prehistory of Humankind, is about world prehistory, human history on the broadest possible canvas. 2 million years ago, humans were still confined to tropical Africa south of the Sahara. Only a few thousand of them, living mainly in the more open savanna and woodland areas of eastern and southern Africa. It was in this crucible, and it is a crucible, of human evolution, that at about 2 million years ago, new, more advanced humans appeared. They are known generically as Homo erectus, the human who stands upright. In time, Homo erectus spread widely over the Old World, into Asia and Europe, but not into the Americas, which is an important point which we'll resume in Lecture 11. Many forms of this archaic human evolved in different environments. And one of the big differences now, after 2 million years ago, is the increasing environmental diversity of the world and the increasing frequency of major climate change. This climate change is encapsulated in the last great geological era, the Pleistocene, which is commonly called the Great Ice Age. This last great geological era began somewhere around 1.8 million years ago, just as Homo erectus appeared in Africa. Is there any connection? We don't know. During the Ice Age, northern latitudes became colder, but climatic fluctuations between warmer and cooler conditions were relatively minor until about 750,000 years ago. About 780,000 years ago, the Earth's magnetic field reversed abruptly for reasons which are unknown. And now, continual climate change gripped the Earth and has continued ever since. Since this moment, 780,000 years ago, at least 9 glacial periods, separated by shorter, warmer intervals, have descended upon the Earth. For over 75% of the last 780,000 years, the world's climate has been in transition from warm to cold and back again. Generally speaking, the freeze has been gradual, the warm-up rapid, but the periods of cold are longer than the periods of warm. All of which, of course, raises an interesting question as a sideline. Are we still in the Ice Age? Yes. And some experts believe that in 23,000 years or so, we will resume another glacial period, which of course raises the next question, which is, what is going to be the effect of anthropogenic, humanly caused, global warming on these long-term cycles? Yes, global warming by humans is a reality, but its effect on long-term Pleistocene change is unknown. But it's worth noting, to go back to prehistory, that both Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, that is modern humans, evolved during a time when the world was generally cooler than today and the climate was constantly in transition. These constant changes played an important and still little understood role in the spread of early humans out of Africa into temperate and more tropical regions. The humans known generically as Homo erectus evolved into highly diverse populations in many parts of the world. It's very difficult to describe them and generalize accurately, but we must make an attempt. These archaic humans generally had a larger brain than Homo habilis, varying between about 775 and 1,300 cubic centimeters, far larger than the 600 to 700 cubic centimeters of its predecessor. Homo erectus skulls are very distinctive, with more rounded shape and conspicuous bony ridges over the eyes. The limbs and hips were much more modern looking, almost modern, sometimes slightly bowed and fully adapted to the upright posture. Humans now were extremely nimble. These archaic humans also had hands fully capable of precision gripping and many forms of tool making. They were still short. They stood at about 5 foot 6 inches tall. The earliest forms of Homo erectus developed in tropical Africa. And, as inevitably happens when more and more fossils come into public knowledge, we find the scientists subdividing and subdividing again. And there are many people who call the Homo erectus that appeared in Africa Homo ergaster instead. I prefer to use the name Homo erectus as a generic name here simply because it makes our lives a little less complicated. As with all of his prehistory, reality was much more complex than we know. The reason to do this is simply we do not have enough fossil specimens to work with, so our knowledge of them is very, very incomplete. The earliest known Homo erectus or ergaster finds come, as did the earliest tools, from the Lake Turkana region of northern Kenya. A skull dates to between 1.6 and 1.7 million years ago from that area. It has massive brow ridges, an enlarged brain size, and a high forehead. It has many resemblances to much later Homo erectus specimens. An even more interesting find came from the western side of the lake, from a place called Narikatomi. Here, a skeleton of a 12-year-old boy dating to about the same 1.6 to 1.7 million-year-old period was discovered in the remarkably complete state. This has given us an interesting snapshot of archaic human anatomy. From the neck down, the boy's bones are remarkably modern looking. His skull and jaw look more primitive, however, and his brain at that age was about half the modern size. The Turkana boy confirms a common theory. The different parts of the human body evolved at different rates, with the body itself achieving a near modern form long before the head. But one thing is quite certain. The tool-making abilities of Homo erectus or Ergaster were vastly superior to those of earlier humans. Technology changed considerably. You'll recall that Homo habilis used Oldowan technology, a chopping tool flake technology, which used sharp-edged flakes as knives or to scrape bones. But now things changed. Archaic humans began to flake stone on both sides, and they began to make pointed stone axes with sharp edges, and also flat-topped cleaving tools. Modern experiments, and I have done this myself, have shown that such tools are sharp enough to cut through the hide of animals as large as elephants, and they slice readily through sinew and flesh with great efficiency. These tools, which have a pointed end and sharp edges, and normally a fairly well-formed base, although obviously the early ones were far more primitive, have many uses. The point about hand axes is that they were very versatile artifacts, like the chopper and the flake. They could be used to butcher meat. They could be used to scrape skins. They could be used to dig up roots, tubers, edible tubers in stream beds. And they could also be thrown as fairly deadly missiles. People have actually experimented with this. Over the next million years, and this technology lasted an enormous amount of time, the hand axe became a highly sophisticated object. There were many shapes, especially in Europe, where hand axes developed a great sophistication given what they were. There are forms with beautiful points. There are others which are oval-shaped. There are even some with a twisted S edge. All of them highly effective cutting tools. This technology is known as the Acheulean. It's named after this town of Saint-Acheule in the Somme Valley of northern France. It's very interesting to note that discoveries of stone hand axes in the gravels of the River Somme in 1859 and before, in the same levels as the bones of extinct animals, were the first sign that humans had lived on Earth at the same time as such extinct animals as elephants in Europe. So this hand axe technology, and hand axes have been found by the thousand in the gravels of the Somme and the River Thames and other European valleys, was a highly distinctive technology which was very adaptable and was something that was portable and used for many purposes. Very different to the rather opportunistic tools of earlier times. To make a hand axe, which an expert can do in 2 minutes, is quite easy. But to make really refined ones requires the use of bone hammers and all sorts of more elaborate techniques. At some point, too, Homo ergaster, or Homo habilis, Homo erectus, tamed fire. One of the great innovations of prehistory. We do not exactly know when fire was first domesticated, but almost certainly I would have thought it was domesticated as a result of a brush fire started by a lightning strike or something like that. This new artifact was very important. It not only provided warmth, but it provided protection against predators. It also could be used to cook food, as well on occasion as serving as a weapon in game drives and so on. It was, whenever it was domesticated, a defining moment, because for the first time it allowed people to survive in far harsher environments where temperatures were extremely cold in the winter. It also allowed them to set fire to vegetation, to prey on animals fleeing from the flames. And it provided, as I said, this crucial protection. Quite when it was domesticated is a mystery. Some people, and I'm among them, suspect it was early as 1.8 million in Africa. There was some limited evidence for it. Others believe it happened much later, after 500,000 years ago. In a way, with the huge timescales we're dealing with, it doesn't matter. What's important is that fire at some point entered the human armory. We don't know whether Homo erectus or Augusta was merely a scavenger, or whether humans were now hunting large animals in their own right. Most experts believe that at this point, people were now commonly hunting medium and smaller sized antelope. For example, Louis Leakey himself demonstrated that it was possible for a human to run down a small antelope and wrestle it to the ground. A dangerous pastime, but it can be done. There's no question that that sort of hunting went on from the earliest times. The question was, when did they start tackling really big game? We don't know. About 2 million years ago, Africa's hominids were adjusting to cooler, drier conditions. This expanded the area of open savanna. Environments ideal for bipedal foragers who thrived at the expense of forest-loving primates. And it seems likely that the human population on Earth increased considerably. And then, somewhere between 700,000 years ago and 1.8 million years ago, the date is highly uncertain and very controversial, Homo erectus, the first humans to spread out of Africa, radiated into the wider world. They crossed a then much better watered Sahara, or traveled up the Nile Valley into Asia. Today, we look at the vast wastes of the Sahara and we think immediately of Lawrence of Arabia and shimmering desert. In fact, the Sahara, as recently as 6000 BC, was much better watered than it today, much of it covered with shallow lakes. I like to think of the Sahara as a giant pump. During periods when rainfall was slightly high, and I'm never talking about it being more than a semi-arid landscape, it would suck people in, who would prey on the game, which also entered the desert, living by permanent water supplies. And then as the desert would dry up, which it did many times, it would throw them out to the margins, as happened in 6000 BC, a critical factor in the emergence of ancient Egypt, for example. It's interesting that thousands of Acheulean hand axes have been found in the depths of the Sahara, many of them alongside long dried up lakes. Why did Homo erectus move out of Africa? The movement may have occurred as part of a large interchange of mammals between Africa and more temperate latitudes, which culminated about 700,000 years ago. And please remember, this wasn't necessarily a one-way movement. People may have moved back. There may have been constant gene exchange. between Asia and Africa for a while. And indeed, a recent discovery of a Homo erectus fossil in Ethiopia dating to 1 million years ago suggests that this happened. Once out of Africa, Homo erectus seems to have thrived in cooler environments in China and elsewhere, perhaps as a result of the domestication of fire. For many years, some of the earliest evidence for fire was said to come from China. In fact, this evidence has now been disproved, and the fires are thought to have been of natural origin. In the year 1891, a Dutch surgeon named Eugene Dubois had an obsession with the missing link between apes and humans, and he had himself transferred to Java with the specific objective of finding the missing link, the link between apes and humans. Incredible although it may seem, he found the bones of an archaic human in Java, which he named Pithecanthropus erectus, the ape-human who stands upright. He found this in gravels along the Solo River in what is now Indonesia. This was a beetle-browed human with a primitive-looking face and fairly modern-looking limbs, in short, a Homo erectus. But when he returned to Europe in 1895, scientists greeted his discovery and claims with scorn. Disillusioned, he went into seclusion and kept the fossils in a box under his bed. But it was not until the 1920s, when new Homo erectus finds were made at Zhougoudian near Beijing in China, that Dubois was vindicated. For he was the first person to find Homo erectus in Africa, in Asia, long before fossils came to light in tropical Africa. He was a pioneer. We still know very little about these very early human settlers in Asia. Between about 700,000 and 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus populations were well established in what is now Indonesia and Vietnam. They flourished in a tropical forest environment, where bamboo and other wood resources provided much of their toolkit. All that survives of their toolkit are crude stone choppers and flakes, very much like the ones found in East Africa. Hand axes are only found towards northern Asia, and not many of them. And it seems that these tropical forest people acquired much of their livelihood from smaller game and forest plants, and not from larger animals. They were forest people, not savanna people. Humans were beginning to adapt to different environments. No one knows when people first settled in China, but it was at least 600,000 years ago, perhaps considerably earlier. The most famous early human site in China is the Zhougoudian cave near Beijing, an area visited by Homo erectus between about 460,000 and 230,000 years ago. At least 40 individuals have been recovered from Zhougoudian, and now notice that the number of fossils is increasing, which makes our knowledge somewhat easier. Most of them younger than about 14 years of age. These people were deer hunters, using increasingly sophisticated choppers and flakes and other artifacts such as scrapers. They were highly mobile. Again, their life way was very simple. For a million years, people were mobile hunters living in very small bands with very little change in the way they hunted and foraged. It was very basic. What did become was more sophisticated was their ways of hunting, as we will see in the next lecture. But it's important to realize that during early prehistory, humans were part of a vast animal community. They radiated north into Europe and into Asia at the same time as many modern grazing animals and predators. But Homo erectus was more successful than other mammals, simply because it had the ability to adapt to rapid cyclical changes in Ice Age climate, which took place after 780,000 years ago. These changes were particularly sharp in Europe, where there were ice sheets over much of northern latitudes during glaciations. On the other hand, in Asia, early Asians foraged in thick forests and sometimes in more open country, using a simple but highly adaptive toolkit which remained in use until at least, this is a long period of time, 75,000 years ago, and in some places considerably later. The reason this happened is probably that a great deal of their technology was in bamboo, and the technology required to hunt and forage for plant foods in rainforest is not particularly elaborate. By 250,000 years ago, Homo erectus had evolved considerably as far as skeletal morphology and brain size was concerned, not only in Asia, but also among their very distant relatives in the far west. These changes related to brain size in particular, because humans were acquiring new skills, and they were acquiring these new skills because they had the ability increasingly to interact with one another, to plan hunts, to cooperate, because many of the most successful hunts depend on an ability to cooperate with others. But the population of Asia, the population of the Sahara, the population of the more open areas of South Asia at this time was minuscule. It's very easy for us in our crowded modern world to think that there were a lot more people around at this stage of prehistory than there actually were. You're talking about a few thousand people scattered over a vast, varying landscape in teeny bands, many of which probably had almost no contact with neighbors through their short lives. Life expectancy was extremely short, probably at the most for most people in their 20s. They were living in predator-rich environments, still equipped with very rudimentary weaponry, and their most effective tool against being killed and eaten, was their sheer mobility. Their ability to move, their ability to smell, their ability increasingly to communicate with each other, maybe even with some rudimentary sounds to give warning of danger. You see, increasingly humans were becoming emotional people. People who communicated their feelings with smiles and frowns, movements of the head, and grunts. And this ability translated probably, although we do not know, of course, into slightly more complex social institutions, maybe even larger bands of people living together, foraging and hunting. But humans were still very much part of a larger animal community. They were increasingly efficient predators in a world crammed with predators, and they were increasingly skilled at adapting to climatic extremes. And within all this was a constant mobility that had populations flowing back from Asia to other areas. No part of the world was completely isolated, although obviously in terms of contact we're talking about something much smaller scale than was the case in later times. And much of the time these teeny populations were isolated within their large hunting territories with little contact with anyone else. In this lecture, we've talked about the radiation of Homo erectus out of Africa. We talked about the first Homo erectus fossils in Africa itself. And we've talked about the first settlement of Asia and some general principles of human behavior at the time. This is a black hole in our knowledge of prehistory. We still know very little about these critical movements that brought people into the wider world. In the next lecture, we'll move on to slightly firmer ground when we discuss the first settlement of Europe and the very different human societies which developed there after 800,000 years ago.